Welcome to the History Maps podcast. When we think about monumental human engineering, we usually look up, like we picture steel skyscrapers or maybe suspension bridges spanning these impossible gaps.
Right, or rockets breaking the atmosphere.
Mhm.
We tend to think of civilization as building vertically.
Exactly. But if you look at the sources gathered for this deep dive into the sources, you start to realize that the most profound engineering project in human history is completely horizontal. It is the soil itself.
Yeah, it is the physical manipulation of the earth on a continental scale.
So today we are looking at the history of agriculture in China. And our mission here is to really trace this massive narrative of human adaptation, environmental engineering, and statecraft. A story that begins in the Neolithic era and carries all the way through the imperial dynasties.
And it is a fascinating journey because we are exploring how the domestication of specific plants and animals did much more than just, provide calories. It literally molded the physical geography and the political systems of one of the most enduring civilizations on the planet.
And for you listening, grasping this specific history provides a really clear blueprint for how human societies actually scale up. Because feeding a massive, dense population requires systems far beyond just putting seeds in the dirt.
Oh, absolutely. It demands hydraulic engineering that redirects entire rivers, intricate tax and land distribution laws, and just this continuous, unrelenting push for technological innovation.
Right. So let us start at the very beginning. When looking at the Chinese tradition, the origins of farming are deeply intertwined with mythology. We have this whole pantheon of cultural heroes and deities who are credited with inventing agriculture.
Yeah, and in the study of historical Chinese culture, you frequently encounter this double tradition. You have the historicized version of events, the physical archaeological record, and then you have the mythological version.
Where complex, multi-generational human processes are distilled into the actions of specific divine figures, right?
Exactly. The mythology encodes the history.
So the most prominent of these figures in the sources is Shennong. He's generally revered as the inventor of basic agriculture and the plow. But the sources note he seems to have originated as a god of the burning wind. Now, a burning wind sounds inherently destructive. It sounds like a forest fire, not a farm.
It does. But if you look closely at early agricultural methods, that destructive element actually makes complete sense. The burning wind is very likely a mythological encoding of slash and burn agriculture.
Okay, so how exactly did that process work for an early farmer?
Well, before you have metal axes or heavy plows, clearing dense virgin brush or forest is just a nearly insurmountable physical task for human muscle. So early farmers would use fire as a tool.
They just burn it all down.
Basically, yeah. They would cut what they could, let it dry, and then burn the area. And the fire does two vital things. First, it clears the physical obstruction of the undergrowth. Second, the resulting ash provides an immediate, potent influx of nutrients directly into the soil.
I see. So the deity of that essential clearing fire simply evolves over time into the deity of agriculture itself. Because, without the fire, there is no field.
Precisely. The mythology preserves the practical ancestral memory of how farming began. And Shennong is part of a larger group of these figures. We also have Huji.
Right, and historically, there are references to a figure named Ji Qi, who eventually became the posthumous deity of agriculture. The sources note the name Huji breaks down clearly. Hu means prince or deity, and Ji means agriculture.
Right. And then there is Shujun, who is credited with a very specific advancement. The sources say he invented the use of bovine draft animals to pull plows.
See, that feels like a highly specific thing to attribute to a mythical hero to me.
It is specific, but that is because it represents a monumental paradigm shift in energy. Transitioning from human muscle power to animal muscle power for breaking the soil is, well, it is one of the most significant leaps a society can make. The mythology elevates that technological leap to the status of a divine gift.
Yeah, that makes sense. We also see Surin in these texts, the hero who taught humans the use of fire through a fire drill. That enabled cooking, which fundamentally changes how humans extract nutrients from food.
Absolutely.
And throughout all these myths, there are constant references to the 5 grains, the wugu. These represent the traditional granular staple crops that formed the foundation of the diet.
So these myths really reflect the primary anxieties and requirements of the earliest agrarian communities. I mean, they needed fire to clear the land and process the food. They needed animal labor to manage tough soil. And they needed reliable seeds.
Right, and regarding those seeds, the sources contain a very specific and unusual detail. There is a prevalent myth across multiple accounts suggesting that the ancestral seeds of modern crops were originally found stuck to the hair of a dog.
Yes, the dog hair myth.
I have to question the traditional framing of this as a mystical or divine discovery, though. If we think about the reality of early foragers living in temporary settlements, doesn't this point to something entirely accidental?
How do you mean?
Well, I imagine early humans living alongside their newly domesticated hunting dogs. The dogs run through wild stands of grasses, get burrs and seeds stuck in their coats, and bring them back to the camp. The humans pull the seeds off the dog, discard them in a waste pile, and later notice those seeds germinating right there in the camp.
That is a very grounded interpretation, and it actually aligns perfectly with how archaeologists view the transition to agriculture. It was not a sudden revelation where someone woke up and decided to invent farming.
Right, it was gradual.
Very gradual. It was a long, slow period of broad spectrum gathering. Humans were gathering wild plants, hunting, and just living in closer proximity to the flora and fauna around them.
So the dog hair myth is essentially a folk memory of humans realizing that the wild environment was encroaching on their domestic space and that they could manage it.
Yes, it captures that intimate, messy relationship between early human camps, their earliest animal companions, and the local wild greens.
The sources also note that the Great Flood motif is heavily tied to the acquisition of agricultural civilization in these myths.
And that points to the ultimate physical prerequisite for scaled farming in this geography. The myths often describe a massive flood that lasts for years, bringing chaos, until a hero finally channels the waters and controls them.
Encoding the reality of the river valleys.
Exactly. It encodes the reality that early farming communities had to understand and manage hydrology before they could establish permanent, thriving settlements.
So while the mythology attributes these leaps to divine heroes, a helpful dog, and tamed floods, the physical archaeological record points to a story driven by climate shifts and intense human observation.
Right. And to see that physical record, we look at the Neolithic period, roughly 10,000 years ago. What the sources show is that independent domestication occurred in two completely distinct ecological zones.
Let us examine the north first, the Yellow River Basin. Around 8000 BCE, this region sees the domestication of foxtail and broomcorn millets. What does that environment actually look and feel like?
Well, the Yellow River Basin has a temperate continental climate. It is semi-arid. It receives only 400 to 800 millimeters of rainfall annually.
That is not a lot of water.
No, it is not. And that rain is mostly concentrated in a brief window during the summer monsoons, but the defining feature really is the soil. It is loess.
Loess. That is a wind-blown silt, correct?
Yes, it is a fine, powdery silt that is blown in from the deserts over millennia. It is highly fertile, but incredibly prone to erosion. It is a dry, dusty, challenging landscape. To survive there, early humans needed highly drought-tolerant crops.
And that leads to millet.
Millet grasses are uniquely suited to this. They possess a specific biological trait. They are C4 grasses.
Okay, let us clarify what a C4 grass is. How does a plant like millet actually survive in an environment that dry?
It all comes down to how the plant breathes and processes carbon dioxide. Most plants, known as C3 plants, open their stomata, the pores on their leaves, during the day to take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis.
But if you open your pores in a hot, dry environment, you lose a massive amount of water through evaporation.
Right, you essentially sweat to death. But C4 plants, like millet, have a more efficient carbon fixation pathway. They can partially close their stomata during the hottest parts of the day and still effectively process carbon.
Oh, I see.
This means they require significantly less water to produce the same amount of biomass. They lock in their moisture.
So the early inhabitants of the Yellow River Basin were essentially selecting plants with a biological superpower for drought resistance. And we see the results at sites like the Paleogen culture, dating from 7000 to 5000 BCE. The excavations show structured villages with storage pits containing millet remains. It is an early system of mixed farming.
Now, if we look at the south, the Yangtze River Valley, the environmental conditions mandate an entirely different approach.
Right, the south is the birthplace of wet rice agriculture, developing around 8000 to 6000 BCE. How different is the Yangtze Basin from the Yellow River?
It is practically a different continent ecologically. The Yangtze Basin is subtropical. It is humid, receiving 1,000 to 2,000 millimeters of rainfall annually.
So more than double the north.
Easily. The winters are mild and the landscape is defined by alluvial floodplains and heavy monsoon inundation. It is a world of standing water.
The sources detail excavations at the Kwahukiao site in eastern China, where they found evidence of rice cultivation dating back 7,700 years. But the crucial detail is that the remains were a mix, half-domesticated japonica species and half-wild types.
And that mixture perfectly illustrates the slow process of domestication. They were actively cultivating wild rice, but over generations they were selecting for specific beneficial traits. The most important of these traits is the non-shattering panicle.
Okay, let us break that down. A panicle is the part of the plant that holds the seeds. What does it mean for it to be non-shattering?
In the wild, a successful grass needs to reproduce. When the seeds are mature, the plant is biologically programmed to shatter, meaning the seeds detach and fall to the earth to grow the next generation.
Right, which is great for the plant.
But from a human perspective, a plant that drops all its seeds on the ground before you can harvest them is useless.
You would be picking individual grains out of the mud.
Which is terribly inefficient. So early humans naturally favored the mutant plants where the seeds stayed firmly attached to the stalk even when ripe. They harvested those, planted those seeds the next year, and gradually bred out the shattering trait entirely.
And the mixed remains at Kwahukiao show this exact transition in progress.
Exactly.
Moving slightly later, to the Hemidu culture from 5500 to 3300 BCE, the sources show settled rice agriculture taking place on raised fields. By the time of the Majiabang culture, rice is the absolute foundation of the southern economy.
So we have two divergent technological paths. The north relies on dryland farming with millet, and the south relies on wetland farming with rice.
But the sources also identify a transitional zone where these two worlds meet. The Jiahu site in Henan, located on the Huai River, dates between 7,000 and 5,800 BCE.
The geography of Jiahu is key. It sits between the Yellow and Yangtze River systems. The archaeobotanical evidence there shows something notable. Early rice farming occurring well north of the Yangtze, operating alongside traditional hunting and gathering.
It shows that populations were experimenting and adapting crops outside their core zones of origin.
Yeah, and the domestication process was not limited to plants. Livestock management was developing simultaneously.
Right. The sources mention that pigs were domesticated locally by 8,200 years before present. Pig bones found at Kwahukiao show distinct morphological changes, like a smaller body size compared to their wild boar ancestors.
Pigs became an absolute anchor for these settlements, especially in the north. They provide a dense source of calories through meat, and they consume agricultural waste.
Win-win.
And more importantly, they produce manure, which is essential for maintaining the fertility of the loess soil. Chickens, derived from Southeast Asian red jungle fowl, were also integrated into these early farmsteads.
But the narrative around cattle is distinct. The sources indicate that cattle were introduced from Near Eastern lineages around 4,300 years ago, appearing first in the Yellow River Valley.
Right, and the zooarchaeological data and isotopic analysis of these cattle remains suggest a specific primary function. They were not being bred primarily as a meat source.
They were used for plowing. And if we think about the reality of manual labor, adopting cattle for plowing is the Neolithic equivalent of acquiring a heavy-duty tractor. A community does not adopt these massive animals just to get a slight increase in dietary protein. They adopt them for mechanical torque.
That torque changes the fundamental capacity of a farmer. Human muscle can only drive a digging stick or a spade so deep into the earth. Animal traction allows for deep tillage.
It rips through tough root systems.
Exactly. It brings buried nutrients to the surface and vastly improves the soil's ability to retain water. It represents a total transfer of the physical burden of farming from the human body to the animal body.
With the foundation of millets, rice, and animal labor established, these early societies began to optimize. And in the north, that optimization led to a massive shift in their primary crop, a shift that changed the trajectory of the entire region.
Initially, broomcorn millet was the dominant crop in the north. But around 6,000 years before present, during the Yangshao period, a rapid transition occurred. Foxtail millet completely replaced broomcorn as the staple grain.
Why is this switch?
It was a calculation based on yield and palatability. Foxtail millet is significantly more productive. It generates more grain per unit of cultivated land, and the historical consensus is that it tasted better to the populations cultivating it.
But broomcorn has its own advantages, right?
Yes, broomcorn is much more adaptive to severe cold and extreme dry spells. It is a hardier, tougher plant.
This raises a question about risk assessment in antiquity. If you live in a semi-arid region like the Yellow River Basin, where rainfall is erratic and droughts are a constant threat, broomcorn provides a safety net. Switching almost entirely to foxtail millet means they were betting their survival on higher yields while intentionally abandoning their environmental safety net.
That is the defining tension of agricultural optimization. By choosing the higher yielding crop, they accepted a higher degree of risk. To mitigate the danger of a failed foxtail harvest, they had to rely on more intensive labor, better soil management, and the early stages of water control.
The immediate benefit, however, was a caloric surplus.
Right. Foxtail millet provided more food, which allowed populations to grow rapidly, providing the extra labor needed to manage the more demanding crop.
And the sources show the cultural impact to that surplus. The rapid spread of foxtail millet coincides exactly with the expansion of the Yangshao culture.
The Yangshao culture is recognized archaeologically by its highly distinctive painted pottery.
There is a direct, data-backed correlation in the sources. Sites that have a high proportion of foxtail millet remains, like the Wejiawopu site, frequently contain this complex painted pottery. Conversely, sites with very little foxtail millet, like Hamanmanga, lack the painted pottery entirely.
It is a clear physical demonstration of how agricultural surplus creates cultural complexity. When broomcorn was the staple, the margins for survival were thin. Nearly everyone had to participate in food procurement.
But when foxtail millet increased the yield, it freed up human time.
Exactly. You see the emergence of specialized artisans people who could dedicate their days to refining clay, managing high-temperature kilns, and developing artistic motifs because someone else was growing enough food to feed them.
Alongside the pottery, we see a shift in the tools used for the harvest itself. The sources note a transition from sickles to stone knives. A sickle is a curved blade designed to grasp and cut the entire stem of the plant near the ground. Why would they transition to using smaller stone knives?
The tool shift indicates a highly specialized approach to harvesting. The stone knives were designed to clip off only the edible spike or panicle of the millet. The rest of the stalk was deliberately left standing in the field.
Why go through the tedious effort of clipping the tops and leaving the stalks, rather than just sweeping through with a sickle?
It comes back to the specific nature of the lowest soil. It is highly susceptible to wind erosion. If you cut the entire plant down to the soil, the winter winds will strip the topsoil away.
Oh, I see.
Leaving the stalks standing provides a physical barrier that slows the wind and anchors the soil. Furthermore, as those stalks decompose, they return organic matter to the field, or they can serve as winter grazing for livestock, which in turn manure the field. It demonstrates a highly sophisticated understanding of long-term soil health.
As these systems matured, the distinct northern and southern traditions began to interact. The sources highlight the Wadian site in the Central Plains, dating from 4,300 to 3,800 years before present.
Wadian is a critical intersection. The archaeobotanical data there reveals a highly mixed farming system. They were cultivating significant amounts of both foxtail millet and rice in the same vicinity.
It shows that populations, along with their distinct botanical knowledge and farming tools, were migrating, meeting, and integrating their techniques.
But as these populations grew and relied on the immense surpluses provided by these crops, they encountered the limits of local, village-level management. They were betting on high yields, but to secure those yields against the volatile climate, they had to manage the environment on a scale far beyond individual fields.
They had to control the rivers.
Yes, the natural hydrology of China, particularly the Yellow River, is uniquely challenging.
The sources state the Yellow River carries an average of 1.6 billion tons of silt annually. That is a difficult number to conceptualize.
It is massive, and that immense silt load is a double-edged sword. When the river floods, it deposits that silt, which is what creates the incredibly fertile agricultural plains. However, because the river is carrying so much solid material, that silt constantly settles at the bottom of the river channel.
So the riverbed itself is constantly rising.
Exactly. Over time, the riverbed rises higher than the surrounding floodplain. The river is essentially flowing on an elevated ridge of its own making.
That sounds dangerous.
It is. When the monsoon rains hit or snowmelt surges, the water easily breaches the banks. And because the river is elevated, it does not just flood a localized area. It violently seeks a new, lower path, sweeping across vast stretches of populated farmland.
To combat this continuous threat, The sources show that by the Warring States period, running from 403 to 221 BCE, extensive dike systems became an absolute necessity for survival.
This era sees the emergence of dedicated, state-sponsored hydraulic engineers. Figures like Sun Shu Ao in the 6th century BCE and Shimen Bao in the 5th century BCE began designing early, large-scale irrigation and flood control networks. They were applying mathematical and engineering principles to the landscape.
We see the scale of this ambition with the Zengou Canal, constructed in 246 BCE by the state of Qin. The sources note this was a damless system that irrigated 40,000 hectares in the Guanzhong Plain.
Irrigating 40,000 hectares in the 3rd century BCE required a massive mobilization of labor and precise surveying. The water provided by the Zengou Canal allowed farmers to implement double cropping in a relatively dry region, heavily boosting the yields of millet and early wheat varieties.
But the absolute pinnacle of ancient hydraulic engineering detailed in the sources is the Dujiangyan irrigation system.
It remains one of the most significant engineering feats of the ancient world. It was constructed in 256 BCE by the engineer Li Bing and his son, acting on behalf of the state of Qin. It is located on the Min River, a major tributary of the Yangtze in the Sichuan Basin.
The sources explicitly highlight that Dujiangyan is a no-dam design. If the goal is to control a massive flood-prone river and redirect its water to farmland, the intuitive human response is to build a massive wall directly across the flow.
Right, but building a rigid dam across a river carrying a heavy sediment load often leads to failure. The reservoir behind a solid dam acts as a trap. The water slows down, the sediment drops to the bottom, and over decades, the reservoir fills entirely with silt,
rendering the dam useless and highly prone to catastrophic failure.
Exactly. Li Bing recognized that you cannot permanently stop the river, you can only guide it.
Let us examine the mechanics of how Li Bing achieved this without a dam. The system utilizes three main components. The first is the fishmouth levee.
The fishmouth is an artificial Y-shaped peninsula built directly in the center of the river channel. It naturally divides the flow of the Min River into two distinct streams, an inner channel intended for irrigation and an outer channel that follows the natural course of the river, acting as a spillway for floods and sediment.
The second component is the bottleneck channel.
This involved cutting a channel through the solid rock of Mount Yulei. Before gunpowder, they did this by repeatedly heating the rock with massive fires and then rapidly cooling it with river water until the thermal shock cracked the stone.
That is incredibly labor-intensive.
It is. The resulting narrow channel acts as a precise throttle. It strictly limits the volume of water that can flow out of the inner channel and into the Chengdu Plain.
And the third piece, which ties the whole system together, is the flying sand weir.
The flying sand weir is a low-elevation spillway connecting the inner and outer channels just before the bottleneck. Its function is brilliant. During the dry season, when the water level is low, the weir channels water toward the bottleneck and into the irrigation network.
But what happens during a massive flood?
When the floodwaters surge down the inner channel, the water level rises above the lip of the flying sand weir. The excess water simply overtops the weir and is harmlessly dumped back into the outer river channel. Furthermore, the inner channel curves sharply just before the weir. The centrifugal force of the rushing water pushes the heavy sand and stones to the outside of the curve, right over the weir.
It uses the river's own physical force to automatically dredge the irrigation channel. If we use an analogy, building a rigid concrete dam is like trying to block a heavy punch straight on. Eventually, the sheer force of the river and the silt will break your arm. Dujiang operates on the principles of judo. It takes the river's massive, destructive kinetic energy and subtly redirects it, using that energy to clear its own sand and water the fields at a steady, manageable pace.
That is an excellent visualization of the fluid dynamics at play. It is an adaptive dynamic system that harmonizes with the natural behavior of the water.
The impact of this engineering was transformative. The sources note it turned the Chengdu Plain into the land of abundance. It safely irrigated over 5,000 square kilometers of land. And the most striking fact is that Dujiangyan still functions today, over 2,000 years later, still watering the region. There is the Erwang Temple, dedicated to Li Bing and his son, honoring the permanence of their achievement.
Beyond the agricultural output, the geopolitical consequences of these projects were definitive. Systems like the Zhengo Canal and Zhujianyam provided the state of Qin with an insurmountable economic advantage. They possessed a stable, massive agricultural surplus that was immune to standard droughts and floods.
And that surplus fed the vast armies that eventually allowed the Qin state to conquer the rival factions and unify China into its first empire.
Precise.
So engineering the rivers solved the physical problem of getting water to the crops. But as the empire unified and the population scaled, the central state faced a highly complex human problem. How do you manage the ownership and distribution of the land itself to ensure maximum agricultural production, and just as importantly, to ensure the state can extract taxes from that production?
The imperial courts understood that the structure of land ownership was the foundation of state power. If land concentrated into the hands of a few wealthy families, the state would starve.
The sources detail a massive legislative effort to control this, the equal field system, or Zhentianzi.
This system was implemented in the year 485 by Emperor Shaoan of the Northern Wei dynasty, operating under the heavy influence and guidance of Empress Dowager Feng.
Let us detail how this system actually functioned. The core principle is that the state claims ultimate ownership of the land and allocates it directly to the populace based on a strict quota system. An adult male received 40 moos of open fields. A moos is the standard unit of land area. Adult females received a quota of 20 mu.
The open fields, known as Lushan, were designated strictly for cultivating staple grain crops. In addition to the open fields, the state also distributed mulberry fields, called sanction, which were essential for sericulture, the raising of silkworms for silk production.
But the allocation was not a permanent gift. The crucial stipulation for the open fields was that the land had to be returned to the state upon the death of the recipient, or when they reached the age of 66.
This mechanism of continual redistribution achieved several vital goals for the central government. Primarily, it was a direct assault on the power of the hereditary aristocratic clans. Historically, in times of weak central authority, wealthy families would aggressively annex surrounding small farms. They would absorb the land, and the formerly independent peasants would become untaxed tenant farmers or serfs on massive private estates.
And if those peasants are paying rent to a local warlord, they are not paying taxes to the emperor.
Exactly. The equal field system bypassed the aristocracy entirely. By leasing the land directly to the peasant, the state guaranteed that the peasant owed their grain tax, their cloth tax, and their required labor or militia service directly to the central government. It solidified the state's revenue stream and its military base.
However, the sources reveal a very notable detail about the initial rollout of this legislation in 485. Initially, the quotas were not just for free human beings. Slaves received land allocations, and even draft animals received quotas. A single ox could earn its owner an allocation of 60 mio, up to a maximum of 4 oxen per household.
That is a highly revealing stipulation.
If the goal was to support the common peasant and curb the aristocrats, allocating massive tracts of land based on ox ownership seems entirely contradictory. A standard peasant family might struggle to own a single ox. Only the wealthy, entrenched aristocratic clans owned multiple slaves and large teams of draft animals. It appears that this rule was a massive, deliberate political loophole designed to bribe the wealthy elites into accepting the new system.
That is an accurate assessment of the political reality. The Northern Wei government was attempting a massive overhaul of property rights, and they could not risk a full-scale armed rebellion from the powerful landholding families. By granting these generous allocations for slaves and oxen, the state protected the immediate economic interests of the elites, allowing them to retain vast estates legally under the new framework.
With a calculated compromise to get the legislation passed.
Exactly. In later centuries, during the Sui and Tang dynasties, as the central state grew more secure, these specific loopholes for slaves and animals were gradually phased out.
The equal field system proved remarkably durable. It influenced land reforms far beyond China, including Japan's Taika reforms, but the sources note it eventually phased out by the mid-Tang dynasty around the year 780.
A system based on allocating fixed amounts of land relies on one critical assumption, that there is enough unoccupied land available to meet the population's needs. As the system succeeded in creating stability, the population grew significantly. Eventually, the state simply ran out of arable land to distribute.
And combined with persistent attempts by the aristocracy to find new ways to consolidate private holdings, the system collapsed under demographic pressure and was replaced by the two-tax system.
Yes.
Land distribution was a powerful tool, but the state also recognized the need to manage the final product of that land. The sources detail the function of the ever-normal granaries, the Changping.
This institution was formalized much earlier during the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE. It is a highly sophisticated piece of macroeconomic engineering designed to manage price volatility.
Let us trace how volatility impacts a farming society. In a year with perfect weather, there is a bumper crop. The supply of grain surges. Economics dictates that when supply is massive, the price plummets.
And while cheap food sounds beneficial, a total price collapse is devastating for the farmer. If the price of grain drops too low, the farmer cannot earn enough to pay their taxes or buy essential non-agricultural goods, leading to systemic rural poverty.
Conversely, during a severe drought or flood, the harvest fails. The supply of grain vanishes. Prices skyrocket. Wealthy merchants begin hoarding whatever grain they have, artificially restricting supply further to drive prices even higher. The result is famine, starvation, and inevitable violent uprisings.
The ever-normal granary system was designed to break this cycle. The state acted as a massive buffer in the market. During a year of abundant harvest, when prices began to crash, the state would actively purchase massive quantities of surplus grain from the farmers at a stabilized, slightly above market price. This prevented the price floor from collapsing, ensuring the farmers remained solvent.
And the state stores that massive purchase in the granaries. Then, when a poor harvest hits and merchants attempt to hoard grain to price gouge the starving populace, the state intervenes.
The government opens the ever-normal granaries and begins selling their massive reserves directly to the public at a reduced, stabilized price. This sudden influx of affordable grain breaks the merchant's monopoly, forces prices back down, and prevents mass starvation.
It is an intricate system of market intervention designed purely to maintain social stability. The sources note that this concept proved so vital that by the Qing dynasty, it had expanded into thousands of community and charity granaries managed at the local level.
The primary method was broadcasting. A farmer would carry a sack of seeds and throw them by hand across a plowed field. It is highly inefficient. The seeds land at random intervals. Some are left exposed on the surface where birds eat them, and others cluster too closely together, meaning the plants will aggressively compete with each other for water and soil nutrients, stunting their growth.
The multi-tube iron seed drill changes that entirely. It is a device drawn by an animal featuring iron tubes that channel the seeds from a central hopper directly into the earth. It creates perfectly straight rows, and it deposits the seed at a uniform, optimal depth.
The straight rows are vital because they allow for efficient weeding later in the season. You can walk between the rows without trampling the crop. It maximizes the yield of every single seed planted.
We also see the development of the heavy moldboard plow. What is the distinction between this and earlier plows?
Earlier plows, known as ard plows or scratch plows, essentially just dragged a pointed stick or small iron tip through the top layer of the soil. They created a shallow groove, but they did not deeply disturb the earth. The heavy moldboard plow features a large, curved piece of iron, the moldboard positioned directly above and behind the cutting blade.
As the blade slices through the earth, the curved moldboard catches the soil, lifts it, and completely turns it over.
Turning the soil over is a critical mechanical action. It physically buries the surface weeds deep underground, depriving them of sunlight and killing them without the need for manual weeding. It also brings nutrient-rich subsoil up to the surface where the new roots can access it. It prepares a deep, clean, aerated seedbed.
The Han period also introduces the rotary winnowing fan, which mechanizes post-harvest processing. Winnowing is the act of separating the edible grain from the inedible chaff or husk.
Traditionally, a farmer would have to wait for a day with a steady, moderate breeze. They would throw baskets of threshed grain into the air. The heavier grain falls straight down onto a mat, while the lighter chaff is blown away by the wind. It relies entirely on unpredictable weather, and a sudden gust could blow the actual grain away as well.
The rotary winnowing fan removed the weather from the equation. It is a wooden machine with an enclosed fan operated by a hand crank or foot pedal. It generates a continuous, controlled, horizontal airflow. The farmer pours the threshed grain into a hopper, it falls through the artificial wind, and the separation happens quickly and efficiently indoors.
These tools fundamentally change the mathematics of labor and yield in the north. However, the most profound geographic shift occurred later during the Tang and Song dynasties.
During this period, the sources note the invention of the East River plow, which was specifically adapted for the muddy, sticky soils of the southern baddies. But the true catalyst for change was not mechanical, it was biological. It was the introduction of quick-ripening strains of champa rice brought in from Vietnam.
The introduction of champa rice fundamentally altered the demographics of the entire empire.
The statistical shift in the sources is striking. Around the year 750, 75% of China's population lived north of the Yangtze River, centered in the Yellow River Basin where millet and early wheat dominated. By the year 1250, a span of 500 years, the distribution completely inverted. 75% of the population now lived south of the Yangtze River.
It is one of the most significant internal migrations in human history. Part of this movement was driven by necessity. Northern China faced repeated invasions and intense military conflict, prompting waves of refugees to flee southward to escape the violence.
But the warm, wet, subtropical environment of the south provided the pull factor, specifically because it allowed the cultivation of the new champa rice. What made this strain so revolutionary?
Traditional rice strains required a long growing season. You planted in the spring and harvested in the late autumn. The land was occupied for the entire year for a single yield. Champa rice matured significantly faster, and it was highly drought-resistant, meaning it could be grown on higher terraced ground that did not rely on constant river inundation.
Because it ripened so quickly, it enabled double cropping. A farmer could plant a crop of champa rice, harvest it in summer, and immediately plant a second crop, perhaps a winter wheat or another fast-maturing grain, on the exact same plot of land, harvesting it in the winter.
The caloric output per acre effectively doubled. The southern landscape could now support an incredibly dense population.
But that immense increase in yield brings up a significant question about the reality of human labor. If a family is planting, tending, and harvesting a crop, and then immediately clearing the field to plant, tend, and harvest a second crop within the same 12-month cycle, the traditional rhythm of agrarian life is shattered. The concept of a fallow season, the winter months where the land rests and the physical burden on the humans lessens, disappears entirely. How did the rural society manage an unending, year-round cycle of intensive labor?
It required a level of grueling, perpetual physical exertion that is difficult for a modern person to comprehend. The trade-off was straightforward. They sacrificed downtime to ensure survival and support immense population densities. To sustain these high yields without ever letting the soil rest and recover naturally, they had to implement incredibly intense fertilization practices. We have to remember the fundamental geographic constraint detailed in the sources. Despite the vast size of China, only about 10% of the total land area is actually arable and suitable for farming.
When you have an exploding population confined to 10% of the land mass, and you are pulling 2 crops a year from that land, you strip the soil of nutrients rapidly. To prevent the soil from becoming barren, every single ounce of available nutrient had to be meticulously collected and returned to the earth.
The sources specifically mention the extensive use of night soil. This is the collection and application of human waste as fertilizer. It demonstrates that nothing was discarded.
The nutrient cycle had to be closed. The intense focus on maximizing the output of that limited 10% of arable land forced agricultural thinkers to look beyond just planting seeds. They realized that true sustainability required the mastery of entire, integrated ecosystems.
This brings us to the practices of aquaculture and sericulture, the mastery of the waters and the forests. The sources show that aquaculture has deep historical roots in the region. Going back to the Jiahu site, roughly 6,000 BCE, there is archaeological evidence of managed common carp systems.
But it evolves into a highly complex science. By the 5th century BCE, a figure named Fan Li authored a detailed treatise on carp polyculture.
Polyculture is the deliberate practice of raising several different species of carp within the exact same pond. To the untrained eye, a pond is just a body of water. But Fan Li understood that a pond is composed of distinct ecological layers. How does layering different carp species increase the yield?
If you stock a pond with only one species of carp, they all compete for the exact same food source. The pond can only support a limited number before they begin to starve. Fan Li's treatise details how to select species that occupy different ecological niches. You stock grass carp, which feed on the aquatic vegetation near the surface. You add silver carp, which filter feed on phytoplankton in the middle water column. And you introduce common carp or mud carp, which scour the bottom of the pond for detritus and benthic organisms.
Because they are feeding at different depth on completely different resources, they do not compete with each other. You extract the maximum possible volume of protein from a single confined body of water.
And this scientific management of aquatic systems tied directly into forestry, specifically the practice of sericulture, the production of silk.
Mulberry groves were cultivated extensively to sustain silkworms, a practice the sources trace back to at least 3000 BCE. The brilliance of this system is how these distinct agricultural practices were integrated into a closed ecological loop.
The physical layout is crucial. Farmers would construct their carp ponds directly adjacent to, or entirely surrounded by, the mulberry groves.
The process functions as a continuous cycle. The farmers harvest the mulberry leaves and feed them to the silkworms. The silkworms produce silk, but they also produce a significant amount of biological waste. Instead of discarding this waste, the farmers sweep it directly into the adjacent fish ponds.
That nutrient-rich waste acts as a powerful fertilizer for the water, promoting rapid, dense blooms of algae and phytoplankton. This abundance of food sustains massive populations of the filter-feeding carp we just discussed.
And the loop continues. As the carp feed and process those nutrients, their waste settles at the bottom of the pond, mixing with decaying organic matter to form a thick, highly potent mud. During the drier seasons, the farmers dredge this mud from the bottom of the pond and spread it directly over the root systems of the mulberry trees.
It acts as a premium fertilizer, accelerating the growth of the trees, which produces more leaves, which feeds more silkworms, which feeds more fish. It is a zero-waste, fully integrated agroforestry and aquaculture system. It is a level of ecological sophistication explicitly designed to extract maximum perpetual value from a very limited physical footprint.
This incredible level of scientific observation and ecological management was meticulously documented. The sources point to a landmark text known as the Kimin Yaoshu, which translates to Essential Techniques for the Welfare of the People.
The Kimin Yaoshu was compiled by Jia Sixi, an official of the Northern Wei dynasty, in the year 544. It stands as the most comprehensively preserved ancient Chinese agricultural text.
The scope of the work is immense. It spans 92 distinct chapters. It covers standard agronomy and horticulture, but it also delves into afforestation, the intricate details of sericulture, advanced animal husbandry, veterinary medicine for treating draft animals, brewing techniques, and it even features 280 specific cooking recipes.
The inclusion of recipes is significant. It demonstrates that the text was not merely theoretical. It covered the entire life cycle of food production, from preparing the soil to the final nutritional extraction in the kitchen. Jia Sixi gathered hundreds of older, localized, and now lost agricultural manuals and synthesized them into a singular, practical encyclopedia aimed entirely at the survival and prosperity of the populace.
The scientific value of this text is so profound that it crossed centuries and continents. The sources highlight that Charles Darwin actually referenced it. When Darwin was formulating his theories on the origin of species, he saw data on how plants and animals could be modified over time through deliberate selection. He referenced an encyclopedia of ancient China to study these human interventions. That encyclopedia was the Kimin Yaoshu.
It provided Darwin with a deeply documented 1,500-year-old dataset proving that humans could fundamentally alter the biological traits of species through selective breeding and intensive management.
It is a testament to the high science of the era. However, while we analyze the brilliance of zero-waste loops and massive hydraulic works, the sources also contain a stark reminder of the sheer human cost required to maintain this system. We discussed the rotary winnowing fan and the heavy plows, but before total mechanization, processing the harvest demanded immense, grueling physical labor.
Right, the human energy expenditure was vast.
The sources note that historically, the criminal justice system sometimes intersected directly with agricultural processing. The records of the Grand Historian mention that female prisoners were sometimes punished by being assigned as grain pounders, serving as an alternative to corporal punishment. And I want to make it clear for the listener that we are just imparting the contents of the sources here, not endorsing these historical penal systems.
Of course. But that detail highlights a brutal reality. Pounding grain with heavy stone mallets to remove the tough outer husks is repetitive, back-breaking work. It requires massive calorie expenditure. Utilizing penal labor to accomplish this task underscores the state's desperate, continuous need for agricultural processing power. It provides a sharp contrast to the elegant theoretical science recorded by officials like Jia Sixi.
It shows us the physical toll of feeding the empire. Bringing together the localized brilliance of an integrated mulberry and carp pond with the massive state-directed scale of the Dujiang and canals reveals a civilization that was uniquely shaped by the absolute necessity of feeding its people.
We have traced a continuous narrative of overcoming environmental limitations. We began with the early, localized domestication of drought-resistant millets in the dry north and wet rice in the humid south. We saw how the deliberate shift to higher-yielding foxtail millet provided the caloric surplus necessary to drive the cultural expansion of the Yangshao period.
We analyzed the dynamic, responsive engineering of Li Bing, who used the natural flow and kinetic energy of the river to manage the destructive silt of the Min River without relying on rigid dams.
We examined the complex social engineering of the imperial courts, who implemented the equal field system to bypass the aristocracy and secure their tax base, and who utilized the ever-normal granaries to artificially stabilize markets and prevent famine.
And we tracked the massive demographic inversion as the introduction of quick-ripening champa rice allowed for intense double cropping, pulling the population centers southward, a process documented with immense scientific rigor in texts like the Kimin-Yaoshu.
It is a history defined by intense labor, brilliant adaptation, and centralized administration.
Which leaves us with a final concept to consider. When you look at this entire historical arc, the canals cut through mountains, the strict land distribution laws, the invention of the seed drill, and the meticulous zero-waste ecological loops, you realize it was all driven by a singular, unyielding geographic reality. They had to feed an exponentially growing population using only the 10% of their land mass that was actually arable. That constraint forged a society that constantly had to balance the ingenious, localized adaptations of the individual farmer with absolute centralized state-level control over the environment. That dynamic, the necessary tension between local ingenuity and state resource management, is a blueprint that is profoundly relevant today, as modern global populations confront shifting climates and unprecedented pressure on agricultural resources.
Exactly.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.